And okay. And then the second one,
Sorry to step on you there, Molly.
yeah, no, that's good. The second goal was to see if we could assess the impacts of septic failures on water quality under current conditions, but would give us some idea of how this might change into the future, where our concerns might be. Particularly interested in where concerns are, because then we know where we can do, mitigation actions to help reduce future impacts and current impacts. So we started off, ideally, we wanted to build a statistical model that took into account all the things we know are problems for septic systems. Okay, so the hydric rating of the soil, the depth to the water table, the septic absorption. And we did build a model with all of this information. It turned out not to be a terribly good predictor of where septic failures happened. And the reason for that is that the two reasons. Okay, so the only data set we have available are repair permits. Okay, so the only septic that we know has failed are the ones that have been fixed. So that's a little bit of a limitation. The other thing is there are a lot of reasons that septics fail. So we have human influence, so we have poor maintenance, we have people parking on septic fields, we have people planting trees on their septic fields. We have structural issues. So, the age of the system, 20 to 40 years, after that point, they start to fail. The type of the system, how it was installed, can affect the longevity of it. And then we have the geologic issues, which is what the model was looking at. So high water tables, either seasonal or permanent high water tables, low soil permeability, that kind of thing. So we took a different approach. And if you look at this table, what we know about it is that the human influence is a big one, okay? But there are no patterns in how poorly humans maintain their septic, okay? So some people maintain it poorly, some people maintain it well, but there's no pattern there. The structural one, there is a pattern only if a bunch of septic systems were installed at one time. Okay, so if you had a neighborhood that went in and all the septic systems were put in 40 years ago, you'd expect to see that whole neighborhood failing around the same time. But otherwise, we don't expect to see a pattern there. But the geologic one, we do expect to see a pattern, because these are areas where you just get these conditions that are bad for septic systems. So what we decided to do was to start looking for patterns of how septic systems have failed. And this is the part we're going to do across the state, because it doesn't actually depend on being coastal. Okay. So what does it mean? So these red dots on the map are repair permits. So these are places where we know there have been septic failures that have been fixed. And what we can say, we had 9 years worth of this data from the Virginia Department of Health. We can say that this failure is unlikely to be related to this failure down here. Okay, they're in different places, there's different things going on. But these failures here, there's 5 of them in a little tiny cluster, are likely to be related, that there's something going on there causing all 5 of those, some similar process. And this group here, same kind of thing. So what we're doing is we're starting to look across the landscape and saying, are there more failures in a particular spot than we would expect statistically? Okay, so are these grouped more than we would expect? And we have 9 years of data. So this is how the analysis turns out. In each of the 9 years, there is an analysis done that statistically says, is this area seeing more failures than we would expect based on the surrounding areas? Okay. And there's a color. Okay, so the light color means it's seeing a few more failures than we'd expect to see. And the dark color says, wow, there's a lot of failures here, way more than you see in the surrounding areas. And then we stack all 9 years together. Okay, and then you get one of these patterns, which is what I'm showing on the map. And these patterns tell us that in this case, this is an intensifying hotspot. So it started off as there were occasionally more failures than you would expect to see. But by the end of the 9 years, there's a lot more failures than you would expect to see. And then the other one you see a lot of are sporadic ones. So these are areas where some years there were really a lot more failures than you expected to see. And some years there were more failures, but it wasn't that many more. Okay. So our intensifying ones say there is something going on in the spot and it's getting worse. Our sporadic ones say in some years it's really bad, and some years it's not. So the sporadic ones are more likely to be linked to something like a high groundwater table that's intensified by precipitation. Okay, so in those years with heavy precipitation, we see more failures. The intensifying ones are more likely to be linked to something like sea level rise, where you have a process that's kind of constantly moving up. And then we have these dark red ones are persistent hotspots. So these are for all 9 years. There were way more failures than we would expect to see. And we can see that they are kind of scattered across the landscape, but they are heavily connected to waterways and creek systems. Not everywhere. Now, if you look at Richmond, the city of Richmond, we see a lot of hotspots that are more likely related to aging of infrastructure. Okay, so what did we find overall? We found about 38% of the hotspots that were identified were consecutive or persistent hotspots. So these are current issues that are always issues. So, these might be targets for sewer systems, although of course it depends somewhat on where they're located. There's certainly targets for remediation and active and continuous monitoring of the adjacent water bodies, because it is likely they're impacting the water bodies. The intensifying hotspots were only 3%, so that's good news, but these are ones we expect to be emerging issues, so high risk of failures in these areas moving forward. And then the sporadic hotspots were 47% of the ones we identified. So likely due to years of high water tables. And, these are the ones we'd be worried with under increased precipitation, really. The other thing we looked at were what we called high density failure areas. So these were grids where more than 25% of the houses had repair permits in that 9-year period. So there weren't a lot of these, but here's an example of it. They're frequently, and there are only 20 houses in this block, and 6 of them had repair permits in the 9-year period. So that's a 30% failure rate. They weren't a lot of these high density failures, but they are frequently close to the waterway. And so that's concerning both now for water quality and then into the future, where you might see more failures. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this particularly closely, but we also looked at trends in water quality using data from the Department of Shellfish Sanitation. So we were looking to see whether there were positive trends in, positive trends in poor water quality. Okay, so this is looking for fecal coliform in the water. And we use the criteria for closure. So basically, is this how often over the past 9 years would this system be closed for shellfish harvesting due to poor water quality? And when we map that out, these dark spots they were closed 8 or 9 years out of the 9 years. So basically these areas are continuously closed for shellfish harvesting, and the lighter areas were closed once or twice. So this is sporadic, there was poor water quality there once or twice in the 9 years, but otherwise it wasn't closed. What we see is the upper parts of creeks tend to be closed. So part of this is poor flushing. But if we overlay the septic failures on top of it, we can also see this is a persistent hotspot. So over that same 9 years, this area has been having more failures than expected continuously over the 9 years, and we have poor water quality. So can we definitively link the two? No, but it certainly suggests that if we could fix these problems, we might be able to fix this problem too. Okay, and then the last thing we looked at was saying, okay, looking forward with sea level rise, what do we expect to happen? So how did we do that? Basically, we assumed that every septic system was installed originally with 3 feet of distance from the drain field to the groundwater table. And then we looked at the assumed distance from the groundwater table to the surface now, okay, and said, if it's less than 3 feet from here to here, there's no way this system is working properly. And then we can say, looking forward, is that, how's that changing over time? Okay, and so here's a map. These dark water areas, these dark ones, are areas where already the groundwater is too high for a septic system to be functioning properly. And you can see there's just in this area a few buildings that fall into that category. The medium blue is areas where by 2050, we would expect that the systems wouldn't be functioning properly, or 2040, sorry. And the light blue is the areas where by 2080, we would expect them not to function properly. And so we can see that there are some areas that are already clearly problems, but there are also areas where we expect to see problems within the next 20 years. And if we overlay the hotspots on top of these, we can see that we have these areas where we are getting sporadic hotspots, and we're getting persistent hotspots that are related to areas where the sea level is a little high. And so these are areas we really want to watch. So these are already occasionally problems, and we expect this is going to become a bigger issue in the future. So this gives us targets to try and start remediation. So we know that the need for waste management is not going away in the coastal plain or the rest of Virginia. We need to always have some form of waste management. Traditionally, we have done a lot of private septic systems, which is a decentralized system. The burden is on the individual property owner to maintain it. It is also hard to know if they're working properly or not, because people don't necessarily, if they don't have the funding, it's expensive to fix septic systems, right? If they don't have the funding, they don't necessarily want to bring up the fact that their system's not working. But we know there are things that are changing. We know there are a lot of failures already, and that those have health impacts. So the big question is, how do we respond to this? And so this is the difficult question. So we can fix septic systems that we know are problems for the next, make them work for the next 15, 20 years. But probably we need a better solution long-term. So what's our alternative systems going to be? Is it above ground, still decentralized? So the burden is each private property owner. Are we looking at centralized systems? There's no answer to this yet. This is just the problem that we need to wrestle with. Okay, so important points that I want to make is that all of the data we used in this analysis is actually collected for regulatory and permitting processes. It was not collected for this type of analysis. So like I said, there may be failures out there that were not part of this analysis because they never were repaired. We don't know about them. But we do know where we're getting these patterns of change. So we know these are areas where we can target monitoring, and we know these are areas where we can target adaptive actions. So that is all I had to say. I'm happy to take questions if people have them. I see there's something in the chat. I don't know if there are questions.
This is John
Okay.
Bateman. I have a question,
Yeah.
Molly.
Mhm.
So what type of data would need to be collected to be able to make a reliable model that perhaps the health department and planners like myself could use when people come in for septic repairs to know what the future conditions may be, and it may alter the solution that's implemented? And I'm thinking on-site septic evaluators in the health department would primarily use such a tool.
Yeah, so so this type of model is actually a good start for that, John. What of course is not included in this model would have to be collected point by point, person by person, because we don't know right now, is to know what kind of system it is, where it's located on, you know, on the property, right? Because some of these properties are quite big. And how it's installed in the ground, or is it above ground? So there's definitely information that at this point does not exist in a database anywhere and that needs to be collected by individuals. But we can start looking at things like this. Where do we expect groundwater to be too high? And we can also bring in things like where we know there are marginal soils or saturated soils, that kind of thing.
So quick follow-up.
Mhm.
You're doing this at the behest of the wastewater infrastructure work group? Or,
Yeah, yes.
okay,
Yeah.
so are you planning on providing recommendations to them as to what types of data that state agencies like VDH could be collecting that would be helpful in building out a more reliable model in the future?
Yeah, we did actually, we did provide a report to them. And in that report, there were maybe 9 bullets of data that we thought needed to be collected or improved. And
Okay.
some of that actually, John, VDH has started to work on trying to just to figure out where their septic systems are. So that's it's a good start.
And distance to groundwater is also a good measure that would be useful.
Other questions?
Molly, is this data viewer available to the public?
Yeah, it is almost available to the public. We have been working with VDH. We wanted to make sure there were no privacy concerns. But it should, we've worked all that out, and it should be available shortly. We could send the link to Eldon maybe when it's available and he could pass it on.
That'd be great.
Is there anything on the horizon in terms of testing, maybe on a pilot level, to better correlate water quality issues to human impacts?
Yes, so we have been talking, we have a proposal in to do 2 things. One is to work with VDH to collect water and do some different kind of testing, not just fecal coliform, but some looking for optical brighteners and that kind of thing, which can more definitively link human impact, so that septic systems, to the water quality. But also the proposals with NASA to try and do remote sensing of where these water quality issues related to septic could be found. So, you know, I don't know that we'll get funding for that, but that is one of the efforts that's going on. We are also working with people in Georgia and North Carolina to put together a working group to look at how we can think about this on a multi-state level. There are some interesting things being done in Georgia. They have a NSF Smart Cities grant where they are monitoring the inside of septic tanks and the outside of septic tanks and the surrounding waterways to see how much contamination is occurring and what the conditions are that cause that. So that might be informative to us once that study is done.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Hey, Molly,
Molly?
this is Dave Evans with DEQ.
Mhm.
I know your focus here is on sea level and the distance between the surface or the drainage field and groundwater. In other areas, you know, especially further inland, the bigger problem with septics might be the type of soil and poor drainage. And I wondered whether that's a factor that either currently or in your mind could be addressed well with the approach that you're taking.
Yes, so that is something we are planning to consider. Certainly, as we move inland,
Yeah.
you there are really different driving factors for why these hotspots of failures would occur. So yeah, so we do have maps of those. I actually didn't I didn't bring them, but we do have maps of where you have poor poor soil quality, you've got, and also where you have high groundwater. The groundwater maps are not particularly great resolution. But they do start to, at a big scale, they start to inform things. They're hard to connect to an individual parcel.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and Molly, you might
Molly?
want to expound a little bit. Sorry, let me break in real quick to expound a little bit on the participation mapping concept too, that will help it in the future.
Yeah. So one of the things that we are planning to do is, well, we've already started actually. We're working with the Virginia Department of Health inspectors. So these are the people who are on the ground, who are going out, who know their local areas, to map areas where they know there are septic problems, actually not just septic, where they know there's any type of wastewater problem, and identify why those are problems. So to get at that difference between where we have aging infrastructure. So, they know from experience that these are areas with old septic systems, but there's no really good record of it. And areas where the failures are happening because of high groundwater. So that information is really important when we get to the how do you address things question, right? So if it's really aging infrastructure, that's actually a relatively simple fix if funding can be found to address. The rising water tables is more problematic. Definitely requires some more creativity in the approach.
Molly, hi, this is Bryant Thomas with DEQ. Thank you for sharing this. This is really, really fascinating information. One thing I thought I'd mention, you may be familiar with it, but if not, and it goes back to the discussion on monitoring and testing that may be done. And I'll mention it at a high level because it's been a long time since I've looked at it, but the USGS did some work up in Fairfax County as part of some sampling and tracked down kind of I think high density of septics and failures and did so through I think nitrogen or a series of nitrogen nitrates maybe were kind of what caught their eye, and looking at isotope analysis. So on the water quality, and I don't know how transferable that would be to a study, more coastal waters, but it was interesting, and it was a good indicator, I think, of water quality and potential impacts, in addition to some of the other things you mentioned.
Yeah.
Just thought I'd mention.
Yeah, that study, Bryant, it was seen to go over a function of density versus anything else. It wasn't age, it wasn't soils, it was density.
Yeah, and that was an interesting study. The problem we have really is, so we can go into a creek and we could say, we could go into this creek here and do intensive sampling, and we can actually, connect it not just to fecal coliform, which can come from a number of different sources. We could connect it directly to septic through testing. The problem is it's, one creek out of all of this. And so this is where the satellite work would be useful, would be as if we could on a big scale to be able to say, these are the areas we're concerned about, because even targeting monitoring right now is a little bit hard to do. And as far as I know, and maybe DEQ, would like to get involved in this. I know DEQ does do water quality monitoring, but right now the shellfish monitoring is specifically for harvest, right? So to close or open for harvest. So that is for a very specific goal. It's not really to figure out where there are septic issues. So I think there needs to be almost a different monitoring program set up to look at this.
Yeah, and I saw in the chat the comment about potentially useful information for DEQ and TMDLs development or potentially implementation. So, yeah. If you think it would be something you wanted to talk further with DEQ, feel free to follow up if we can be of assistance along the way.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other questions? Molly, can you talk a little bit about your plans to move westward with your work?
Yeah. So the plans are to do the hotspot analysis across the entire state of Virginia. And then we're also doing the participatory mapping across the state of Virginia. So what are we getting out of that? So the hotspot analysis is telling us where we have high density failures. So we know where there are problem areas. And one of the other things, the other pieces we can put with that, I didn't show you this before, but we can also put social economic considerations with that. So we know where there are areas, particularly that are low income, that have a high density of failures, that are good targets for funding. And then the participatory mapping is getting at a couple of different things. So it's getting at where do we know there's big failures of septic, or where do we expect to see them because the infrastructure is starting to age out? Okay, so a little glimpse into the future. It's also getting at where are straight pipes, where are privies, where there are like high densities of privies and straight pipes. So those are different issues from the septic failure ones, but of course important to address in a wastewater management context.
Molly, this is Michelle Edwards with Rappahannock-Rappahannock Regional Commission. Do you have a time frame at all for this, for moving across the state with these studies?
For moving across the state, I think it will be probably within the next year.
Oh.
We've had a little bit. We actually have had some of the participatory mapping done in the western part of the state, but we launched that right when COVID started. So the health departments have been a little distracted. So the goal is to relaunch that effort, so we can get more parts of the state participating in that.
Other questions? All right, Molly, I feel compelled to make an observation, having done some work in some lower income communities where there were high incidence of failures and attempts to create public systems, decentralized systems to solve the problem. And one of the challenges is in those communities, folks who have a failed system but don't have the resources to solve their problem, just live with it.
Yeah.
And there is never an application for a repair permit because they put themselves in financial jeopardy.
Yeah.
So that impacts your data collection and analysis.
Yep.
And my experience and folks that I've worked with on these type of projects is that you're going to undercount. Because I'm not calling the health department, I'm just going to live with it, or I'm going to find my own solution, which could be a straight pipe alternative, and just not talk about it. I don't know what the answer to that is, other than the state having dollar resources to assist those households. And we've made a little bit of progress there. So where's my question? My question for you is, in your reporting, are you able to highlight that factor that really is not quantifiable? I mean, I don't know how you'd quantify it, but it's there. And those who work, well, at the local health department level, sanitary, they know it's there. They just can't say which houses, although they sometimes probably could, but they wouldn't dare because you're putting that household in jeopardy.
So yeah, this is exactly what the wastewater infrastructure work group is trying to tackle. So we know that this analysis is underestimating most, I mean, I would bet it's underestimating the problem because of exactly that reason. This assumes that someone fixed a problem in order to identify that there's a problem there, right?
Yeah, you're using repair permit data.
Yeah, but that's
And-
all that exists. There is
Right.
no, right? There is no database of failures.
Right.
So that is a big problem. And so that is one of the reasons we started the participatory mapping, is to get to a more granular level. So the participatory mapping can circle a neighborhood and say, oh, we know there's a problem here. The goal of that project is to identify areas for funding. Okay, so the goal of the participatory mapping is to identify areas to target funding at. And so that is actually part of the database collection. How close is it to a shovel-ready project to be fixing these issues? So they're not identifying houses, but they are identifying, I mean, sometimes neighborhoods, right? So really granular level. That information is not public because, you know, that's a concern, a privacy concerns. And it's not that we want, we don't want people to be hiding their problems. We want to be offering people solutions, right, on a state level. So that is the goal. John Bateman can tell you he's been involved in several of these discussions, looking about areas in the Northern Neck, that the state's been working very hard to find ways to quash people's concerns about saying they have a problem. Because one of the difficulties actually in handing out funding is that someone first has to say they have an issue, right?
Well, you know, you don't want to report yourself to the health department if the health department's only tool is you must fix your system.
Right.
And if you can't fix your system, what's the health department going to do for a low-income family? They're going to force them out of their house? No.
Eldon, this is Louis. We run the only septic repair program in the Commonwealth, and we've run it for almost 30 years now. So we've got a little bit of a higher level view on a lot of these issues. And so I'd like to offer a couple comments because I think the terminology is important to get correct in this space. When the health department issues a repair permit, that is the database of failures. The issuance of a repair permit has no correlation to a completion statement. A completion statement is when the repair has been fixed.
Right.
So we know, and the health department does the best that it possibly can, but there are repair permits within the health department that have been on file for decades.
Right.
And so there is a significant amount of misunderstanding about the differences between what permits mean when they are issued and the relationship to whether or not there is a failure at that site and whether or not that failure has been addressed. Now, the General Assembly has dealt with this low income question of how do you bring financial assistance into that space? And we have to utilize the waiver program that DDH has within their powers to grant. That is not a water quality solution, and it's not necessarily a good public health solution, but that's how we thread that needle to deal with the low income individuals that can't afford secondary treatment on systems that are pushing $25,000, $35,000, $40,000. The waiver allows the low income person to put right back into the ground, regardless of soil conditions, exactly what was there previously. So that there are choices available for low income individuals. There are financial resources that are available for jurisdictions to utilize. Building that trust within the community that something bad isn't going to happen is vital to bridging that gap. But to be able to do that, whoever's doling out the resources has to have command of the subject matter of all tools that are available, which include the waiver. And probably 80% of our low income individuals have to utilize the waiver option. There's no other pathway, because putting them into a $30,000 septic repair that has a quarterly maintenance payment, that's just bad public policy. They're poor for a reason. They don't have any money. And so they can't service a loan. They can't pay for their maintenance agreement. They have no choice but to go down the waiver pathway. So those aspects are the mechanical side of this that a whole lot of this conversation that we just had just skirted completely around. And that is the reality of where this space is right now.
John's got a question. Thank you, Louis.
Yes, sir.
I was going to say, Louis' example is an example of the PDC coming up with a innovative solution using, what resources they have available to them to try to address the problem. And there are opportunities here. Looking at this map, every one of the residences living in this map has to have their septic system pumped out every 5 years. And we floated the idea of while we have a septic pumper or hauler out there pumping the system out, if they can use that opportunity to identify any issues that they can see immediately, we can then start building a database of problems and start, implementing solutions to fix those problems. So, I mean, we get money through DEQ to administer septic pump out program, as does the Middle Peninsula, and we'd like to explore ways, and we've had discussions with DEQ about how we can start to collect more data while we're out there.
Thank you, John. Other,
Yeah,
go
just, I will start this by saying I am in no way qualified to speak for the health department, but I am aware that they recently have received some additional funding to help support these types of septic repair or conversion issues through the American Recovery Plan Act. So it's a fairly sizable chunk of money by health department standards. But by no means will it come close to addressing the problem, but it's a start. Coincidentally, for the first time this year in our Chesapeake Bay grants, EPA provided an additional $250,000 for work that aligns these areas with areas that are highly effective for pollution reductions to the bay, and with areas that are in underserved communities based on census data. And we're trying to use that money also to target septic repairs in those low-income areas. But yeah, I think Louis' point about, whether you're installing an alternative system that now has ongoing maintenance cost, or even connecting them to sewer that they now have an ongoing cost, is a piece of the equation that is problematic for sure.
thank you, James. Other comments, questions? Molly, Kurt, thank you for this. What is your, where do you think you'll be with this effort, let's say in the first or second quarter of 2022?
I'd say by the second quarter, we'd probably have something more statewide to talk about. What do you think, Kirk?
Yeah, that would be the hope. We're looking to hopefully get the funding in and be able to then moving forward to sweep across the rest of the state. And so I would hope that would be the case by starting in beginning of 2022. We should be able to have some information moving west.
And the reason for my question is I really would like to get this presentation before the elected members of the commission, both state and local. And we'll be in Fredericksburg in late March. And then we will be in the lower basin site to be determined, maybe Tides Inn or that area somewhere in Lancaster County in June. And I would like to get this issue in front of them. And so if you just would mark your calendars, and that will be, those meetings are obviously governed by different rules, so they will be in person. And I would imagine there's going to be some kind of hybrid option, but the quorum has got to be in the room, which presents a challenge for any of us who deal with these things. My PDC guys know that for their commission meetings, so we have to work on site and those kind of questions. But we would like to get you in front of the commission. I think we've got we have members that I think are becoming understanding of the vast complexity of this issue, because as Louis points out, the waiver is an answer, but the waiver is a and pardon me if I offend anybody in the way I say it, it's a financial solution. It is not a health solution. It is not a water quality solution. And it's a matter of, giving somebody who has no way to afford it a way around the regulatory problem. And, for otherwise, the health department in its regulatory roles is forced to do some pretty awful things to households. And so the waiver is the way around it. And it's the only solution that's out there. I'm not going to opine on good, bad, or indifferent. It just is what it is. Okay. Other comments, questions for our folks from VIMS? Thank you. This is some really good work. And I empathize with the weakness of your data sources. And Louis did a good job of pointing out one of the weaknesses of repair permits. Repair permits also has a weakness in that it's where somebody has self-identified, I've got a problem, and I have the ability one way or another to try to address it. You have no way of collecting data on all those people who say, I'm not going into the system. I'm just going to live with it. So, okay. With that, other questions? One more time around.
Yeah, just add, that is also the purpose of that participatory mapping by the health specialist. So hopefully we can get at that answer a little bit by going that route. So again, this is guidance for VDH, and we're excited about it, and it's an important issue, particularly for the locality. So it's a high priority.
Thank you, Kurt. I appreciate that. Okay, with that, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is James Martin, currently with DEQ, soon to be in a new role. James, do you need to be able to share your screen?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay, stand by. You should be able to do that now.
All right. Let's see. How's it look?
It says you've started sharing your screen. Yeah, there you go.
Excellent. All right. Well, I wanted to give you guys a quick run through of where we are with Chesapeake Bay progress, specifically taking a hard look at the Rappahannock River in particular. Let's see, where should I go to advance my slides? So, all right. So here's Chesapeake Bay wide look. Left part of the slide is nitrogen, right side phosphorus. You can see both clearly have declining trends, which is good news. You can also see here in the gap between 2020 progress and our phase 3 WIP level of effort, there is more reductions to come. More work to do. The other thing I want to point out here, particularly looking at nitrogen, is take a look at the yellow bar here. This is the load from septic systems, the yellow is. But really what I want you to see is that through time, that yellow bar stays at about the same level, which means most of the reductions we're seeing are not happening from the natural or agriculture or urban or septic sectors. Most of it's coming from that top dark blue bar, which is the wastewater sector. Conversely, if you look at the WIP3 bar, most of the reductions left to go are happening in natural, big drop in agriculture, and a little bit of a drop in developed. So just to kind of highlight that point, I want to show you this next slide, which takes a look at the reductions that we've achieved since 2009. So 2009 to 2020, looking at nitrogen here, nitrogen reductions. Wastewater accounted for 91% of those reductions, agriculture 6%, natural 3%. Totaling about almost 10 million pounds of reductions, which is tremendous, tremendous effort. But what's remaining is about 8.5 million pounds of nitrogen reductions needed to get down to that WIP level in a period 2021 to 2025. And that the vast majority of those reductions are coming from agriculture, a big chunk from developed, which, oh, by the way, had none over here, and a little bit more from natural and septic. So I guess if you look at this, we're looking at, let's just say that's the same amount of reduction in about half of the time. Need to double our efforts, if you want to think of it that way, and really focusing in on agriculture, developed, and natural loads. Here's the same as previous slide for the Rappahannock. You can see the picture is a little bit different here. The wastewater loads are not nearly as big a component in the Rappahannock as they are bay-wide. A lot of the load coming from agriculture. Again, you can see some reductions have been made, but we have significant progress yet to go. And that a lot of that progress is expected to come from agriculture. So summing it up, from 2009 to 2020, 73% of the reductions came from agriculture. Moving forward, 2021 to 2025, we need about 84. 7% is needed from developed lands, where we had none in the 2009 to 2020 period. But this is only part of the story, right? Because the fact is, these pies are not the same. size. They are in this picture, but this is what it looks like in reality. So far, we've made 415,000 pounds of N reductions in the Rappahannock. We have 1.5 million pounds of reductions remaining. So the other thing I'll mention is this 415,000 pound number would have actually been about 520,000 pounds of reductions based on the BMPs we implemented. But increases in developed lands and increases in the number of septic systems has actually increased loads in those two sectors in the 2009 to 2020 period. So let's call it 3 times the amount of reductions in half the amount of time. So that would be, by my math, about a 6-fold increase in effort needed in the 2021 to 2025 period to meet these targets. Wanted to talk a little bit about land use because it is an important component, particularly land use change. The model estimates that in between 2009 and 2020, the Rappahannock watershed saw an additional 13,500 or so acres of developed lands. And much of that came at the expense of natural landscapes, forest. Some of it, a little bit, came from agriculture. In fact, this is kind of the net change. So it is certainly possible that we had more acres of agriculture turning into developed lands, but then forest lands turning into agriculture. The net effect is a loss of natural and an increase in developed. Now, these estimates are going to be updated this winter, looking at the measured change between 2013 and 2017 interpreted from imagery. That's work the Bay program is doing. We'll have our first glimpse at it in early November as the next version of CAST is released. But the final land use change product will come out a little bit later in the winter, January, February timeline. We need to stop this kind of backsliding, if you will. You know, the Rappahannock is blessed to still have 66% of its lands in natural land uses, but that is fading and developed lands are increasing. Not new news to anybody on this group, I'm sure. You guys know that we've had some rapidly developing areas in the watershed. So here's some key takeaways. Much progress has been made. We have done some great work. Some of that progress has been lost due to growth, increases in developed and septic loads, and that the conversion of forests to developed or other uses increases the adverse impacts of that growth. Much more progress is needed over the next 5 years if we're to meet our goals. And most of those are planned to derive from the agriculture sector. But practices on existing developed lands, particularly unregulated lands, are also needed. We saw that on the earlier slide where we saw an increase in loads resulting from developed lands in the 2009 to 2020, and looking for a significant reduction from those same lands in the coming 5 years. So work to be done in all sectors. Efforts to establish, maintain, and conserve forest cover should be expanded. Headwaters areas and riparian corridors obviously have the greatest immediate impact. I'll mention that these areas also have the greatest immediate impact from a flood resiliency perspective. So there is some opportunities here, but in large, efforts to change our development patterns and development behaviors can help improve water quality, and we will need to take a hard look at those growth, smart growth types of efforts moving forward if we are to be successful, and that those types of behaviors are going to become increasingly important as we continue to face climate change. So that's what I had for you prepared today, Eldon. Here is my contact information, current, as well as my email address that will take effect after November the 10th over at DCR. So thanks again, Eldon. I really do appreciate the invitation and opportunity to chat with you all today.
Yeah, don't go anywhere, James, because if you're looking at the chat, there. Okay, who wants to start?
Uh-oh.
This is John Bateman. David brought it up, but he's definitely brought up something that's of a concern. The increase in development of utility scale solar in areas, and a more disturbing trend where these developers are having people clear large tracts of land of their forest cover before going in with utility scale solar. James, I just wanted to just get your opinion on where you see those numbers spiking, especially with the loss of increase in developed lands going between now and 2025.
Yeah, thanks, John. Completely agree. You know, the 2013 to 2017 land cover change will just start to pick up some of the early solar development. And while we may call them solar farms, the Bay model does not see them as farms. They are seen as impervious surfaces. The area of the panels are seen as impervious surfaces and simulated as such in our Bay models. The area outside of the panel surface, so kind of those gaps in between, typically go into a mixed open, more of a natural land use for the models. So that's the way the Bay program deals with it. So it would be, the impact would be very much similar to any other development in terms of load result from conversion to solar. You know, personally, I think that we really do need to take a hard look at incentives to solar developers to develop on areas that are not forest. You know, I'm not quite sure why it hasn't been a target area. I'm sure there's a good reason, but some of the, you know, transmission corridors seem like a great place to have solar panels. I know you need access and things of that sort in case you have to service those lines, but boy, already it's not in forest, and already it is very close to transmission lines. So seems like low-hanging fruit to me, but yeah, that's kind of the bottom line story on how the model sees solar development. And you know, I think the key to real world, what the impact is from those solar developments, really depends on how the area along the drip line within those solar areas are managed. You know, it could behave very much like an impervious surface, or it could act like a giant best management practice, depending on how how those areas are developed. So I guess I'll stop there.
All right, Pat Cody, you got your hand raised, and you raised a question in the chat as well. Go ahead, Pat.
Good morning, James, and hope you enjoy your new assignment.
Thank you, Pat. Good to see you.
I don't know, listening to the earlier a little bit of the presentation, it sounds like to me it's from the frying pan into the fire, but
Yeah, I think that's where we're all at, actually. I probably 24 questions, but I'll boil it down to 3.
All right, I'll try to keep up as usual, Pat.
Yeah, so no, but we've kind of seen these charts evolve. So the first one is, you can't say this, but I can. It's 2022 virtually, and we're 3 years away. We're not going to make it. So what happens then? So that's the first of 3 questions.
All right, well, let me jump in on that one. I'll say 2025 was never an endpoint, right? 2025 was a goal post. After 2025, if, when, if, whichever way you want to think about it, we hit those, whenever we hit those targets, that still will not be an endpoint, right? We still have to offset load increases from additional development. We still need to install every year those annual practices like cover crops that are maintaining or helping us meet those load targets. We still have to continue to do septic maintenance and pump outs. We still have to inspect BMPs as they reach the end of their credit duration or lifespan and maintain them. So 2025, in my view, was never going to be an end, right? Yes, we've made it, we're done. That's not going to happen. That's not how TMDLs work, right? You have to go about maintaining the cap thereafter. So what happens in 2025? If we don't make it, I don't know. A lot of that depends on how EPA interprets their role within the partnership, whether they would take action to tighten the screws on regulated sources or require jurisdiction states to do so. Could happen. That's kind of within their purview and within the bounds of what the partnership asked EPA's role to be as kind of the scorekeeper and umpire of our restoration efforts. So, or we could set a new date, 2035, and keep marching ahead, recognizing that there's always going to be more work to be done and that we're not really shooting toward an endpoint. We're shooting to achieve a load target and then maintain that cap. So,
great. I'll try to move quickly for myself so others can chime in, but I have a cultural sense that the Rappahannock River Basin Commission, the Rappahannock River, has a kind of a cohesiveness. So what should the Rappahannock River Basin Commission do? And does the state, are there sufficient incentives, financial resources to achieve a 2025 goal in 2025 or 2027, or is there needed legislation and convening or an education? What needs to, what would help?
Well, I think we have benefited from having a goal date of 2025 for sure. We have seen funding levels on the rise. This year, obviously, we have a record-setting contribution to the Water Quality Improvement Fund, which is, I don't remember exactly the number, Eldon, maybe 370, something like that. More than $300 million going into the pot. Tremendous in terms of funding. But truth be told, a drop in the bucket for what's still needed. So I think this year it's going to be especially important for stakeholders to communicate to the General Assembly that while we have this huge pot of resources dumped in the Water Quality Improvement Fund, that the efforts that have been in place over these past few years to increase other sources of funding to fund ag practices, general funding dollars to fund ag practices, and bond issuances to fund stormwater and wastewater upgrades are still needed, right? We can't forget all that. We'll just spend the $300 million that's in WQIF. I don't think that's a great idea because frankly, we have no idea how much money is going to go into WQIF next year. You know, I think we have to keep our foot on the pedal and continue to accelerate.
Okay, last question is, and you can correct if I don't get it quite right, but you know, Rappahannock River, you have Fredericksburg with an MS4, Stafford with MS4. And so you're left with the rest of the jurisdictions kind of doing something when they feel like doing it. But, so as a finance person, I'm trying to figure out if I raise so much money or contributed a new instrument, how much would that help? And it's very hard to get a handle around. And the agricultural sector has been pretty much on the trust me voluntary basis, which you know hasn't worked. So you know, trying to figure out from a finance point of view how to carry the load. I don't know how much load there is to carry, and I don't know how to get people that don't want to do something to do something. So it's
yeah, right. I think I saw somebody else mention property rights, personal property rights in the chat. Yeah, you know, that's the nature of incentive based programs, right? Is you have to find the right incentive. And truth be told, for the practices that we really need more of, forest buffers, wetland restoration, these are practices that take agricultural lands out of production. You can't be surprised that they're not popular with farmers. Right? Farmers make their money by having land in production. So in order to incentivize them to implement those practices, we not only need to pay for the practices, we need to pay for the maintenance, and we need to pay them rent for the property that they have retired to put in conservation. Another opportunity and challenge, I think, is with the growing rate of rented lands. Much of the agricultural land base is rented, and producers that are renting that land are less inclined to take care of it the way they would if it was their own. They are less inclined to make structural improvements to that land, such as excluding livestock, installing a fence, planting a buffer. So we need to think about ways not just to incentivize the farmers, but to incentivize the landholders to take high levels of conservation and require high levels of conservation on the lands they own. And perhaps one mechanism to do that is the land use taxation system. I don't know, but if there was another level of land use taxation that was for conservation lands, not lands conserved, but lands that are best management practices, and those would be taxed at an even lower rate. Maybe that would be an incentive for a property owner it's not going to be a standalone, but along with the incentive programs, maybe that extra incentive pushes them over the edge to implement that practice. You're right, Pat. It is an incredible challenge, and it seems every farm situation is unique. So trying to develop statewide programs that address those issues is also a challenge, right? Trying to find a one-size solution to a many-sized problem, if you will. So, and I think there's some recent efforts at DCR in their cost share program to identify what are the objections that are preventing adoption of these practices, and how do we need to modify the incentive program to try and overcome those objections. So I think we just need to keep working down that road and trying to bring every piece that we can to the equation. Now, I know that doesn't really help you quantify what piece you can pick up and carry. And all I can suggest, Pat, is carry all you can. There's plenty for everybody. So yeah, bring everything you have.
Thanks so much for all your efforts, James.
Hey, thank you, Pat.
James, I got something to add there for Pat. When he was talking about the MS4 jurisdictions versus the non-regulated jurisdictions, DEQ for the last several years has been putting out a survey of stormwater needs across the state. One of the issues we have run into is that basically only the MS4s are filling out that DEQ survey. It sure would be nice if we could get the unregulated jurisdictions to also fill out that survey, so we could get a better handle on what the stormwater fiscal needs were for all of the jurisdictions within the Commonwealth, not just the MS4 jurisdictions. So Pat, if you could entice those unregulated counties to fill out that survey, that would be really great.
Yeah, great point, Norm. I can tell you, I've seen the 2021 draft of the Chesapeake Bay and Virginia Waters Cleanup Plan report, including that stormwater needs assessment, and it literally has 0 as the needs for the unregulated sector, because there were none that responded to the survey in 2021. So yeah, unregulated, that includes jurisdictions that have an MS4, but not an MS4 that covers the entirety of their lands. Think about where there are opportunities. Think about what you need in terms of cost share, and definitely respond to that survey. Thanks, Norm.
James, David Nunley pointed out that he's not aware of them actually receiving it, that survey. And I guess a question back to you on the DEQ side is, are you sure that's being sent to everybody?
Well,
I don't know the answer to that question, so.
I don't either. It comes from our Clean Water Finance Group. I will make a note, and we will definitely make sure that Caroline County is on that list, and every other county, and PDC for that matter, because I do think that this is one where perhaps PDCs might be able to help us reach those local governments and communicate the importance of that survey.
Well, VACO would be an important avenue as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Putting something in their newsletter. Little late to be on their conference agenda for this year, but I think we've got to make sure that people are getting it, and make sure they know what it's for. If somebody's of the impression that this is going to somehow impact me from a regulatory standpoint, that might be a misunderstanding motivator to not fill it out. And instead, they need to understand that this is data that among other things, feeds the resource needs understanding on the part of the administration and the assembly when they're making funding decisions.
Eldon, this is Michelle Edwards. If it's the survey that I'm thinking about, and I could be completely wrong on this, from what I remember, it's very detailed, and I'm not sure our local governments have that data, or it's somewhat of a time sink, and I don't think they have the data collected to be able to populate the survey. They're just not tracking it because they consider DEQ it to be DEQ's ball of wax if they're opt-out localities. And I don't know that they have the knowledge to be able to complete the survey necessarily. It might be beneficial for DEQ to consider a watered down survey for the non-MS4s that they're more likely to fill out and not just take a look at it and decide this isn't worth their time.
Okay, good point, Michelle. Sounds like there needs to be a how to get the survey done conversation for DEQ, and maybe James, you can suggest to the folks in that side of the house that maybe they could start with a conversation with PDC reps on how can we do a better job of getting the data in.
I think that's a good suggestion. I will absolutely make that.
Okay, good. And that would become part of the army of the willing, as Pat refers to them. Other questions, comments for James? I'm going to stay out of the solar discussion for now. We're going to save that for another day because that gets into a whole economics and economic growth discussion. And I'm not going to. We'll be here far longer than our normal time slot if we start into that debate today. But it is that we've got a public policy problem in utility scale solar. We're doing some good things with it. We're also neglecting some other related issues that go with it, trade-offs. And other comments, questions for James? Since I declared utility scale solar off limits. I'm watching John smile. Yeah. Okay, folks, thank you. Great information and discussions today. Stuff we're going to be talking about more as we roll into 2022. And as we talk about what needs to be bumped up to commission level discussion. And I think some of what James talked about, we need to get what the essence of his report to us a few minutes back before the commission, so they appreciate the magnitude of the gap remaining and where it's got to come from. You talked about WQIF and the large amount of funding, and it is historic. There's no doubt about it. But that's primarily that funding is primarily aimed still at the wastewater side. And I know the assembly recognizes and is trying to do more on the incentive-based ag side, but we've still got, even with that level of funding, we're only about halfway to what the assembly understands is needed on the wastewater side. And so we've still got some issues, some hills to climb, and Pat's raised his hand again. So before we go, Pat.
Yeah, I would just offer, I would hope if this, the essence of this briefing can be taken to the commission, that it'd be really nice if the presentation was structured in such a way that there was a commission discussion rather than here's the data and everyone looks to the left and right and says, I hope you're doing something about this. And kind of, is there legislation needed? What can we do? Get a deeper discussion than just giving data, which looks pretty daunting.
Point well made, Pat. And therein is some of the challenge. You can lead the horse to water, but James and I have talked about this presentation being in front of the commission in December. We've got a pretty full agenda as it stands, and it may be that James and Bryant and I will have a conversation. It may be a DEQ DCR presentation, and that would be appropriate. But we've got a pretty full agenda. I don't see, if we get it before the commission in December, I don't see them having much discussion time, but it will afford the opportunity for the chairman to make the point to the commission that we need to continue that agenda item and start talking about the how and what policy changes may be needed. I was a little intrigued, James, by your land use value taxation point, and should there be another category? For another reason, I had to do a little research on that recently, and that authority for that tax relief that the Assembly has structured and is one of our oldest land conservation programs is actually embedded in the Constitution. And the 4 categories are it's spelled out. So, it immediately caused me to think, could we do it as a variant of one of the existing, or would you have to go so far as a constitutional amendment? I would hate to think that would be the case, but I was unaware until somebody dragged me into some of that research that the land use value program, not in those words, are embedded in the taxation portion of the Constitution.
And I think it's also important to note, it's still a local option, right? Some don't have it at all.
Right.
Many counties don't have it at all. So.
And not all of them use all 4 of the existing categories.
Right.
One of the things we learned in our forestry work of a few years ago was that one of our counties in the lower basin doesn't even include forestry. And when we questioned the Commissioner of Revenue as to why that was, and he was a commissioner who had been around for quite a while, he said, "Oh, that's simple, because most of our forest land was owned by Continental Can, and we weren't going to give them a tax break." So, which is not the case anymore. That was from a different era. In forestry, that tax break is critically important to what we want to accomplish in WIP 3. Anyway,
and I mean, the reason the tax break is there, though, is because those large parcels in conservation, well-managed uses is seen as a public good. Well, I can tell you that a poorly managed farm is not in the public good. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
And that opened the door for Bill if he wanted to chime in at this point. So I'm gonna give Bill Etney a chance to respond to that before we call it a day.
Gee, thanks, Eldon.
Hey, you're the farm man here today.
Yeah, specifically on the land use issue, it is in the Constitution. However, there are several ways to value land under the existing categories. One of the issues that we're going to run into is few localities in in the eastern part of the state have the resources to actually value the land up to the capabilities in the code. Generally speaking, it's a very wide brush valuation. Just to give you an example, on one of my farms, I've got about 15% of the forest land is in non-harvest areas. I pay the same tax on that as I do on the most productive forest area. That's probably not an incentive for me to put it in that non-harvest area. It's really not. I think it's something that I sympathize with the localities. They're all looking for money. They're looking for simplicity. But from an equity standpoint, we're not always doing the things that encourage good conservation uses.
Okay, there we go. There's another gauntlet thrown down for more discussion at a future time. Bill, you and I are going to have a conversation offline about that. I'm intrigued, because James makes a good point, and with your shift over to DCR, I think we'll be having more discussions. We've are there opportunities to move the ball forward by making some state level tax policy decisions that are beneficial to the landowner as well as to the locality. So with that, folks, great discussion today. Any other comments before we call it a day today? Thank you, everyone. And
Thanks, Alvin.
yeah, thanks, Pat. John, you turned on your camera. Is there something you wanted to add? Okay, great. James, you and I will be having some more conversation. And Bill
Sounds
Latney,
good.
Bill Latney, no, he's still on. Bill, I'm going to be calling you in the next couple weeks. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
So long.
Bye.